Zycus? Yeah. Zycus is a leading global provider of complete source-to-pay suite for procurement solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and the operational aspects of procurement. Zycus, as you can see, is also a consistent leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing. And it's 4 years in a row, 2013, 15, 17, and 18. So I'll hand over now to John, who can take it ahead.
Thank you, Harsha. And you know what? I think we lost Colin's picture. Colin, can you still hear us?
I can hear you. I've lost your pictures. I can see my picture on the screen, but I've lost yours.
Okay, well, we can see everybody but you.
Suddenly disappeared. Right, well, that's great. Okay. Showing everything's okay, but for some reason it's not connecting. The picture isn't showing.
Well, let's get.
I don't know why that is.
There. See, well, you know what? We can hear you at least, right, Rob? Can you hear Colin as well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so you know what?
I'll switch my camera off and switch it on again and hope that does the trick.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's start with introductions, and I'm your moderator today, John Hanson. Thank you for joining us, and let me first of all introduce you to our expert panel, and I'm thrilled to have Robert Handfield join us, and he's Executive Director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative, is a Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at North Carolina State University, Poole College of Management, and Director of Supply Chain Resource Cooperative based in Poole College. Is there anything else I should add to that, Rob? I mean, we could read more because the credentials are certainly lengthy.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say is I have a blog I write quite often on. It's at scm.ncsu.edu, and feel free to browse that when you have a chance.
Thanks for sharing. I know I've read your blog and very good content and worthwhile information. So glad you're joining us again today, Rob. And of course, I want to welcome someone I've known for a long time, Colin Cram, Chief Executive of Mark One Ltd. You know what, Colin? I mean, you've besides being a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, you've been in the procurement game. I don't know if that's a fair term, but certainly for more than 30 years with central government, higher education, scientific research. And, you know, one of the things that we met many years ago was based on your paper Towards Tesco. Remember that?
Yep.
That was quite a while ago. So, you know, let me ask you, beyond these things, what would you like our audience to know about you?
That's a very good question. I hadn't thought of that as an answer, or that as a question. I guess, well, I run a conference company in the UK. I do a lot of speaking, running workshops around the world. Well, Middle East, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, and Africa. And generally keep myself pretty busy.
So you've got a pretty global perspective as well, I would imagine, and certainly understanding of the EU marketplace as well. Well, listen, I'm happy to have you join me over these virtual airwaves once again to talk about today's topic and subject, which I'm sure you'll bring a whole lot to it. And of course, I'm your moderator. I'm the editor and lead writer for Procurement Insights and host of the PI Window on the World show on Blog Talk Radio. So again, I'm glad to have you join us. Now, I want to go over a couple of things here before I even get into the tweet chat. This is going to be very much an interactive experience. And what I mean by that, and our intention is rather than just talking at you, certainly myself and the panelists are going to be talking about the key areas on this particular topic today, but I encourage you to avail yourself of the Q&A and chat room sessions. Yes, there'll be a Q&A at the end, but if you have questions or thoughts or agree or disagree with anything we're saying, we want you to be an active contributor in this webinar. So please feel free to post the Q&A. I'll be monitoring it throughout the entire session. I'll be posing questions to you as well. There'll be a series of polls, one coming up very shortly, that we'd encourage you to participate in. But again, this is very much an interactive session, so you are as much part of this discussion as we are. Now, one of the things that's good about Twitter, Chat, is, as you can see, we have a hashtag called DigitalProc. So after or following the webinar itself, we're going to be posting the poll results and continue the discussion and conversation, broadening the input from a variety of different people, experts, industry thought leaders who will join at that point in time. And oftentimes I've seen with these webinars where a week or 2 weeks afterwards the conversation is continued on. So please make note of the hashtag DigitalProc, and feel free to join us afterwards and over these coming days. Now, starting off today's agenda, we're going to focus on 3 areas. What is digital reality? What is digital reinvention? And what is digital readiness? And again, the purpose of this is that everyone's talking about digital transformation. What does it mean? And at the conceptual level, I think we all understand how potentially exciting it is, but in a very practical, on-the-ground basis, what does it mean, and what are you seeing, and what do you anticipate it has in terms of impact for for the way in which you do business? So those are the 3 areas. I want to start with digital reality, and we're going to open, Harsha, with the first poll. My organization's supply chain has already been digitally transformed. Strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or not sure. You got a minute, and we encourage you to respond. In the meantime, I'm going to open to the panel. I'll start off with you, Rob, and then go to Colin. Rob, you know, when we talk about digitally transformed, that seems like a very wide-ranging, vague term. What should it mean for the purposes of our discussion? What does digital transformation mean?
Well, I think it really is about, has it fundamentally changed the way that you make decisions and the way you operate? Let me give you a great example of that. You know, I think most of us are digital natives. You know, when we clock off work at 5 o'clock, you know, we'll get on our phones, we'll book a movie on Fandango, we'll choose a dinner based on Yelp, we'll use Uber to get or Waze to get home. You know, we're totally connected to the digital world, but yet when we go to work, you know, we go back onto Excel, right? So I would think that the workplace has really to catch up with the personal space that people have, and so I think we're actually behind especially in procurement relative to the power of technology that's out there today.
Well, now, see, that's an interesting point you raised, because the ubiquity, and Colin, I'll go to you, the ubiquity of digital impact on our everyday lives, I think is interesting, because in the past, the technology at work was always different than the technology at home, such as it was. Nowadays, buyers, professionals, supply chain professionals, procurement professionals say, you know, why can't we have, and speaking to Rob's point about Excel spreadsheets, why can't we have the same digital experience at work, or technological experience and convenience at work doing our job there, as we do when we, let's say, use an Amazon or book a movie? Where's the disconnect there?
You wanted me to answer that, John?
Yes.
I think what I tend to, well, I think there's a number of disconnects. One is there's sometimes a bit there's rather more risk at work if you actually start to engage in digital technology and really use it for particular things. There is more risk. I think there's mostly the way we engage with technology at home, there's actually pretty limited risk. It's pretty easy, for example, to order from Amazon and companies like that. Very little risk there. So I think there's potentially big risk at work and big risk for the organization. So you need organizational buy-in into whatever you want to do. I think one of the issues is that you talk about much more complex things. If you talk about managing the supply chain, which is a complex business, then people can get bogged down in the technology and actually start to lose sight of the objectives that you're trying to achieve. So I think there's more risk. I think people can lose sight of the objectives. You also need to get buy-in from other people in the organization. If you're doing stuff yourself digitally, then you've only got to get to the agreement of yourself.
Okay, but now here's the thing, and sorry to interrupt. Here's the thing. This is an interesting point. I'm going to go back to you, Rob, on this one as well. Is the inherent risk or perceived risk is one at work. So the risk isn't so much resident with the procurement professional, per what Colin's saying, because they're using it at home and feeling comfortable. The risk is the mindset of the organization itself. I mean, is that really where the challenge is, Rob?
Yeah, I think the risk is that, the risk is so great that organizations are almost paralyzed. They don't want to, there's risk with data. And I think the lawyers especially are very good at sort of increasing the perception of risk that exists with any new technology. I remember having a conversation one time with someone around sharing data and making data available in real time. And they said, well, there's too much risk. What if other people see the data? Or what if, other people sue us because we're being transparent with our data? That is a risk. It certainly is. But, is there crime in the city of Pittsburgh? Yes. Is it okay to share those statistics? Yes. Could you actually use that data to highlight those areas where potentially the crimes are occurring and to be able to focus law enforcement in those areas? Yeah, and you could actually, they're reducing the crime. So it's a risk, but it's also an opportunity. And I think organizations have to look at it that way, that if you're not going to do something with your data, if you're not going to digitally transform, the real risk is you'll be left behind.
Okay, now I want to hold that thought because, Colin, I'm going to ask this, but Harsha, how's the polling coming? Because I'd like to be able to move on if we could.
Okay.
Okay.
See the polls?
Yes, I can see the poll results. That's great. So what we have here is that's interesting. My organization's supply chain has already been digitally transformed. Somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, and not sure. So that's kind of an interesting response there, and maybe reflects what Colin, both yourself and Rob, what you were saying, is that, the perception of risk. Now, this is the thing, and before I go to the next slide, because a lot of what we're talking about right now will sort of explain the results and the general sentiments. But, Colin, one thing that came up in a recent article in CIO magazine and I think it was a Harvard Business Review article or a ZDNet article, where they said that the biggest concern amongst executives, the number one fear, is not the economy and not the traditional fear factors. The biggest fear, they said, was that technology was advancing so quickly that it was going beyond their ability to harness it and have security in place to be able to protect that data to which Rob was referring to. And this was a survey from 2018. I mean, is that part of the thing, that why they're sticking with Excel spreadsheets? Is that part of the thing? Because it's known and it's sort of like tightly controlled, and that this fear factor centers more around security than anything else?
I think it depends on the objectives of the organization and the way that, to a great extent, and the way those objectives are passed down. We were talking earlier, John, about the objectives of procurement. And procurement and supply chain management's objectives need to be very clearly aligned with those of the organization as a whole. And I was arguing yesterday at a conference that, in fact, the objectives should be determined by the chief executive, maybe with the finance director. Interesting, because you find that the chief executive and finance director sometimes have quite different objectives. So that reveals some problems. If you've got very clear objectives, then you've got issues to solve. How do you deliver those objectives in the most efficient and effective way? If you can still achieve your objectives by doing nothing, by not changing, why do you want to change? Change is risk. It can be a career-limiting opportunity if you get it wrong. If you get it right, who is going to thank you because you're still delivering the same objectives?
Okay, but here's the thing.
So why risk?
So it's very much a risk. It's very much a risk reward. But as you said, and let's go to you, Rob, with your comment, the opportunities through going to transforming your enterprise digitally, the opportunities associated with this, with information and insight that you can use to perform better, to understand your market better. I mean, isn't that reward far outweighing the risk and going to drive organizations to maybe not accept risk, but to find ways to deal with risk more effectively and more proactively? I mean, is the reward enough?
Well, I think, to Colin's point, you have to be very clear as to what your objective is as you go into a digital transformation. I mean, and it's generally going to be one of three things. It's going to be, are we really trying to drive efficiency, effectiveness, trying to reduce cost? That's option one. And are there opportunities to deliver to the bottom line? Number two, is it a revenue generation opportunity? Are we going to improve customer satisfaction, customer performance, gain market share, what have you? Or the third option is, are we really moving towards a completely breakthrough industry model where we're creating an entirely new business model that has never been developed before and with never before developed capabilities? And that third one is highly risky, obviously. But I think you have to be very clear as to what your objectives are. You need to have a 5-year vision for where you want to go. And then that's really what guides the transformation, I believe.
Okay, well, now, here's an interesting thing, and then, Colin, I'll go back to you. The impact of emerging technologies, and we've provided the link to the source of this information, is that 70% of digital innovations in industry are delivered through the supply chain. 70% are the supply chain. So, I mean, that goes in line with the realization of the marketplace now that supply chain is being seen more strategic than it is just buying and selling or buying something at the cheapest price. However, only 2%, and this is in the McKinsey study, only 2% of organizations of those organizations have a forward-looking digital strategy relative to their supply chain. So here's the thing, which came first? You have the opportunity for digital advancement that is so largely dependent on the supply chain, yet only a small percentage of companies actually have a forward-looking digital strategy in place. Isn't that automatically going to keep people in a constant state of inertia? Or, as HBR reported, incumbent firms in the McKinsey survey are failing to adjust to the digital era. I mean, are we in this holding pattern where the promise is there, but it's out of reach because we're risk averse? What do you think, Colin?
I think that some organizations, well, we know from your statistics, it might not be very many, but some organizations are adjusting to the digital world. But again, I think you need to be absolutely clear why you want to use digital technology and also what it is capable of doing for you. I was reflecting on the digital transformation of the supply chain, and I think it means much more than doing things differently, and it should produce some very clear benefits. I thought, well, it should mean making suppliers, including the subcontractors, almost part of the manufacturing process. The supply chain starts some way back with subcontractors somewhere along the line and ends with the customer. Manufacturing is in between, but nevertheless, it's all part of the supply chain. So I thought, well, what does digital transformation mean? What could digital transformation do? And I think maybe ultimately it ought to be able to manage the supply chain, including the manufacturing. There's nothing new in that, but I think the technology now enables us really to start doing that. Maybe even having, with artificial intelligence, which now has access to the internet, actually even doing some of the sourcing, finding ways to reduce supply chain steps and costs and risks. Now, I think that artificial intelligence will be capable of doing that. It'll be capable of using data, perhaps ultimately much more effectively than people. We were talking about, I think Rob was saying that people struggle to use the data they're getting. Well, I think ultimately artificial intelligence will enable that. And obviously artificial intelligence will start to contract with suppliers. And there's little bits of software now that start to enable it to do this. It's very basic, but I think that over the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, we're going to see some massive transformation there.
Well, let's get into that momentarily. Sorry to interrupt here, but here's the thing, Colin, and I what you're saying, I agree with it, and we'll peel back that onion, if you will, on those key areas that you're talking about, touching on some of the key areas of digital transformation. But here's the whole question. With all of those opportunities and going forward, and I wanted to, Harsha, pose a question to the audience. For some reason, I can't get my Q&A to share. But what do you believe, audience, is holding your organization back from going digital? But if we look at this, and I want to move on to the next section, but the question is simply this: transformed or be transformed? Kevin Piesker, president of Microsoft Canada, said that organizations will either transform or be transformed. In other words, going to what you said, Rob, is you will be left behind if you don't make the jump to digital. So in this context, what exactly do we have to do, Rob, to overcome that? We know the technology is there, or potential of the technology, but what do organizations have to do to overcome this? What do they have to do to say, when are we going to hit that critical mass where people say, okay, we know there's risk, but there's risk in everything. We've got to transform because we're going to lose. What are going to be those watermarks or those jump off points that are going to really get this gaining traction?
Well, I think first of all, I don't think you can say we're going to go digital and it's like you flip a switch and you go digital. It really is. It's a process, and that process involves really learning what technologies work, how to exploit those technologies. Do you have the data that can form the basis for those decisions? So we're involved in a number of those kinds of projects with some of our supply chain resource cooperative partners at NC State. And what we find is, it is really a 5-year process, but you have to start by looking at a basis of, what is your data quality? What is your data governance? That's the beginning. And then you start to say, well, let's start building some KPIs. Let's start building some business intelligence applications that can be useful, that can be shared among people. So you have to sort of standardize on the technology. And then you have to really start thinking about what are the predictive analytics that can be used. The danger I've seen is if you just say, okay, we're going to go digital, let's everyone ready, set, go. I was working with a hospital and they had over 500 different, Tableau analytical files that they were using to measure pretty much everything in a willy-nilly way. And it was overwhelming. So, you can't just let everyone kind of run off and do whatever they like and give them tools. There has to be a thoughtful process about what are we trying to achieve and how do we go about this in a structured manner. And I think the best way to do that is you have to put a dedicated team to work on this. And they have to be sort of separate from the organization. The rest of the organization is continuing with the business of running the business, but you have to let this team operate independently, almost like a skunk works, to really start to build this plan and this vision and to start piloting and to start working through it.
Okay, now, Colin, and I want to move on to the next section, but one thing you said, Rob, yesterday, and I'll pose it to you, Colin, is Rob, you said, don't be afraid to fail, but fail quickly and then move on. I think that was what you said. Do I have that right?
That's right. That's correct, yeah.
Okay, so, Colin,
failure. Right?
Failure, I don't know if using it as being inevitable, but you're going to have setbacks with any kind of strategy. I mean, is failure okay?
Failure can be extremely useful. If you're actually trying to do something new or do new things, sometimes you're going to fail, but you can learn a lot of lessons from them. I think that so there's a lot of scope to fail here without damaging the organization too much. But maybe you need to, if there are risks of failure, which there always are, then at least if you're going to try pilots, then pilot something in an area where failure is not going to matter too much to the organization. So, yes, there's nothing wrong with failure. But what there is wrong is if you've allowed failure where it has an impact, serious impact on the organization or significant impact on the organization, that's failure. And failure
maybe that speaks... Sorry, maybe that speaks to what Rob was saying, is you can't just jump into digital, because that's a sure way to have failure. There's inevitable setbacks along the progression, but ultimately you have to have a team in place and you have to have a strategy. You're not just getting into it willy-nilly. I think that's really, I mean, that's the best way to say it, perhaps, is to sum up this first section, would be that, number one, digital transformation has real tangible benefits, but to cultivate that, you have to get over the fear factor of it and put in a coherent strategy that you have to follow through on, and recognize that there may be bumps in the road, but like any new technology or any new development to progress in industry, you have to be able to chart that course effectively and then measure the results as you go along. I mean, is that a fair way to end this first section?
Yeah, I think it is. I think also it reflects, there's a comment by Renata who said, digital platforms that are transformative span our different processes, process owners, departments. The main obstacle is to have all these stakeholders align on objectives, priorities. That's exactly right, Renata. I mean, getting everybody to think about what is the objective? What are we trying to achieve here? Why are we even going digital? Is it efficiency? Is it revenue driven, or is it transformative, a new business model? And if we can start to, think through those kinds of elements and then align on that objective, and senior management has to approve it, then we have a mandate and we can start to move forward.
All right. Let's go to the next section, and we're talking about, in terms of digital reinvention. With what do you, audience, most associate with digital reinvention? Is it algorithms? Is it blockchain? Revenue growth, change management, or talent shortage? So while we cue that, Harsha, let me turn to you first, Colin, and I'll go to Rob this time second. Colin, what is digital reinvention usually associated with? I mean, it's a ubiquitous and at times for some vague term, but out of these or others, what do you associate it with?
Well, what do I associate it with, or what do others associate it with? I think that I would guess that most people would actually go for D, which is change management, and I guess that's more or less that's a good part of it. But I think algorithms are going to be increasingly important. Algorithms that can actually support the use of artificial intelligence. So I think that change management may be in the past. Algorithms, I think, are going to be increasingly important because of the potential coming from artificial intelligence. Obviously, one wants to introduce digital to grow revenue, but I'm not sure that people necessarily associate digital with growing revenue. In the retail trade, perhaps it does, but I'm not so sure it necessarily does in a lot of other areas. So,
all right.
Yeah. Okay.
Rob. Okay, so there we've got that change management and algorithm, big part of it. Rob, what are your thoughts when with digital reinvention? What are your thoughts, and more importantly, perhaps, or certainly interestingly enough, what do you think the audience's response is going to be?
Yeah, I think algorithms again are really the foundation of all new digital transformations. Is working with multiple data sets, multiple forms of data, combining them in ways that we haven't seen before. Honestly, I think one of the biggest opportunities for AI right now is on data governance and data quality. And we've worked with a few companies, especially in the healthcare space, that are really focused on using algorithms to help clean up and improve the database of spend for a number of hospitals. And I think that's a first place to start, is if you can start to get good data. The algorithms require good data. If you don't have good data, the algorithms will certainly produce an output, but do you trust the output? So algorithms are really what's involved. We have a couple of doctoral students that have done some machine-based learning and natural language processing kinds of work. These algorithms are very difficult. They're very tricky to work. You have to do a lot of different iterations to get them to function. But when they work, they work very well. And I would go with the algorithms as well, like Colin said.
Harsha. I don't know how much time we have left on the poll, so it'd be interesting to see the term. Oh, here we go. So change management. 63% said change management, 25% said algorithms, and 13% said revenue growth. Now, I want to ask the audience, and feel free to use the Q&A facility, where do you see revenue growth coming in? Why did you choose revenue growth? Why did you select change management? It seems that Colin and Rob, they align a little bit with what we were saying in terms of what's transpiring and what people would most likely associate it with. And let's break down each one of these, starting with algorithms. And much like you and Colin had said, based upon the year of the digital supply chain, or an article that just came out in December, algorithms are the heart and brains of the digital chain. They predict and manage business. They use formulas that rely on real data to draw conclusions and take actions, and artificial intelligence, machine learning, to make supply chain smarter every day. Now, going back to these formulas, Rob, that's what really you were talking about. I mean, you're only as good as the formulas you get to drive that particular data, correct?
That's correct. And the data forms the basis for these algorithms. So when you establish, good data and good data governance processes, which is really how do you capture that data? How do you restrict the flow of that data? Then that really becomes the basis for it. Alternatively, organizations are building, data lakes or data warehouses where they're saying, look, we know that our organization is spewing out, all this data. Some of it is good, some of it is not. So we need to have a process to really pull the good data that's been validated, that's been cleansed, that we know is quality, into this data lake, and that data lake then becomes the basis for all of the analytics, the algorithms that we use. So in a sense, you have to start to decide what data is important, what data goes first class into this data lake, and what data are we going to use in these algorithms. And that then, before you can even get there, you have to decide, well, what are we trying to achieve? What metrics do we want to have? How are we going to use the information in our decision making? How quickly do we need to get it? So these are decisions that really, you start with that vision, and then you kind of back into it as you start to do the deployment.
Okay, so now let's go here a little bit, and Colin, in terms of the algorithms, because they are at the core of it. Is this part of the risk factor that people have, and let's go back to our earlier point. When you go home and you buy something through Amazon, or you use some of the digital technologies, and I'll give you an example on the next slide as to how that's used, why do we not question? Because algorithms are at work there as well. I mean, is it because they work in the background, we don't see them? But these algorithms, wouldn't they go a long ways towards removing the risk?
Let's just take it back to data. I mean, algorithms manipulate data. One thing I learned very early on in my career is that data often provides you enables you to ask the right questions. So I think we often see data as someone as enabling you to get the right answers, but in the first instance, it'll often enable you to ask the right questions. And if you don't ask the right questions, don't be surprised if you don't get the right answer. So I think that, so from that, and I'm not quite sure how artificial intelligence is going to manage that. I'm sure it will do, because you can get the right answer then by linking that data with all sorts of other data. So you call it big data. And I think that, so ultimately, I think that,
well, okay, but here's the whole point.
I think that data is the issue. Manipulating data using algorithms is fine, but just be aware of what you're getting. You may not be getting answers. You may actually, if you look at it hard, be getting questions.
Okay, but here's an interesting point, and Rob, I'm going to go back to you, and let's use this Under Armour example where you got connected fitness from smart shoes and other sources. I mean, I'm a runner, I jog, I run marathons, I have my heart rate and everything connected to programs. I know what I'm doing in real time, my average time. I mean, we have confidence in that. Shouldn't what we have at home in situations like these instill a certain degree of confidence in the workplace? Like, it seems like we're more digitally advanced at home than we are at the workplace. and we have more trust in it. And one of the things I find about the digital advancement at home is, regardless of what your position is in the organization, whether C-suite or on the front lines, I mean, we're all exposed to this now. One would think that the algorithms, if they work in these types of situations, which are easy to see the benefit, one would think that they would also work in the corporate environment. So where's the disconnect there? Because I think we're more digitally and technologically savvy than we ever have been.
Yeah, I think we are, again, at a consumer level. But then again, there's an awful lot of people generating an awful lot of apps that, never get used. So I think there's a whole ecosystem that allows that creativity to occur. As Colin's pointed out, in a corporate environment, that there's regulations, there's SEC, there's legal implications of how data is reported, there's data security issues. So there's a whole suite of other concerns, and I think very often these are very cumbersome. They tend to get in the way of the free flow of data and information, and there's also a restriction around who gets to see what within the organization. So there's a lot of these risks and concerns from a legal standpoint and a financial reporting standpoint, I think, that have to be addressed before organizations can move as quickly into this digital world.
Okay, now before I get into the next one on blockchain, Colin, I'll start off with you, but to both you, Rob, and Colin, a January 18th CIO magazine article said that to transform digitally, you have to transform your people, and by providing them with the tools like the 3 Ws, workspace, workforce, workplace, and workspace. A CIO article on the 18th said that we have to introduce a consumerism to the corporate environment to digitally transform it. And what cued me to remember that is you just used the word, as consumers, we're different. Is that really what it's all about? Is the consumerism is bringing that mindset? And when they talk about a consumerism relative to technology in the CIO article, they're talking about mobile apps, they're talking about technological and other tools with which we are most familiar in the home. I mean, do we have to become more consumerist? I don't know, is consumerist even a word, but more consumerism, as CIO talked about, Colin, for this to actually start getting beyond the barriers to which Rob referred?
Well, I would still go back to objectives. I don't think you're going to change people's behavior too much unless you've actually got the right objectives for them. And so those need to be pretty clear. I think that because you have to say, well, you can change the room, you can move around the desks, buy people better desks and so on, nicer IT, all sorts of things, maybe provide them with coffee machines. But I don't think that's going to make any difference. People do need to be driven by objectives. And if the objective requires them then to really start engaging with digital technology in order to deliver those objectives, then I think that's when you're going to get the change. If people find that they cannot deliver their objectives without engaging in digital technology, then they engage with it. So I think it's the pressure. If you don't change the objectives, then people are still going to play safe. Why would you not do so? So there needs to be this sort of impetus, this drive, something that actually compels you, this catalyst for change. And I think people respond to that. Now, you get maybe some incremental change if people don't have the objectives, because some people will want to try out new technology and so on. But it'll probably be pretty incremental change. And if you want to stay in business, that may not be enough. We've got some really great examples in the UK. Major shopping chains now look as if some of them are on the way out. And that's because people can now order direct from Amazon and various other companies. So
sorry to interrupt there, Colin. Sorry to interrupt there, because you bring up a good point, and it goes back to the first section, is that either transform or be transformed. I mean, we're moving towards the stage. We're moving towards the stage now where risk, all things being considered, and that consumerism mindset that permeates and can close down a well-established business if they don't digitally transform. I mean, it renders a lot of these discussions not moot, but certainly have to measure how long you're going to allow it to influence. Anyway, I want to go on to the next thing, blockchain. And no one responded that blockchain was part of digital transformation. And what's interesting is blockchain the answer to all digital supply chain problems? And you know, one of the things that came through here that aligned with this is actually no. Blockchain pilots have not delivered the results. So, you know, I'll start with you, Colin, because I know you have a special place in your heart for blockchain, and I say this with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, and I'll go to you, Rob, on this. I mean, blockchain seems to be everywhere, and everyone talks about it, but from a supply chain standpoint, it actually doesn't seem to have any real impact or merit. Colin, in a minute or so, what's going on with blockchain? Because it seems everyone agrees with what your take on it is.
Well, first thing is that it requires the sharing of commercially confidential information. I think most organizations will be actually quite reluctant to do that. So you've got a major cultural change, and I'm really not quite sure the benefits of that cultural change. I think that there's all sorts of digital ways to improve supply chain management that don't necessarily require something like blockchain, which also people struggle to get their heads around. So is blockchain the answer? I don't know if it's the answer to anything on supply chain management. For me, it actually is likely to deliver incremental results. And I think there are probably simpler ways of using technology to deliver those same results. So that's my thought on that. Okay, blockchain is probably a lot more secure than other ways, but I'm sure that methods can be found. So it just seems to be a complicated way of trying to maybe achieve not a huge amount of change.
Got it.
Rob. My thoughts. People may disagree with me, but that's my thoughts on it.
I mean, what are your thoughts on blockchain?
Yeah, so you know, we've done a number of sort of proof of concepts with some of our partner companies, again at the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative, on blockchain. And you know, I think certainly blockchain has a huge amount of potential. I think, you know, to Colin's point, blockchains can be hacked. You know, no one has shown that they cannot be hacked. In fact, I think there's a case that shows that one blockchain was hacked and somewhere in the order of $30 million was disappeared. And I think there's certainly, blockchain is just that. It's a technology. It's an interesting technology, but you know, the issue I think is how do you use them? Where do you use them? That can be the most interesting. And I think what we'll see is organizations will sort of develop their own private blockchains, and they'll use it with trusted partners. And you know, it can be used to exchange information that much more quickly, you know, for certain specific and unique applications. You know, a good example was some of the warranty and contract work on software, for instance. You know, when you click that on your email. So there could be those kinds of things where there's a very unique application for it. I think it'll start to grow, but I don't think it's the end all and be all that everyone, you know, claims it is at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know. My sound is temporary. Oh, I think it's coming back, the sound.
Yeah, we lost you, John.
Yeah.
We lost John somewhere along the line here. So
right, okay, yeah. So I thought it was maybe my end.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble. I'm having a little trouble with the freezing here, so apologize for that. By the way, Q&A, box. I can't seem to get mine to function. So it's not that I'm not asking questions, but if you do have comments, please share them because I can see them. I just can't post any questions there. So let's move beyond blockchain. Let's look at, and there's an example of, and much like yourself, Rob, of Arison, who had some success with it. But obviously, let's ask this question. Digital supply chains drive revenue growth. Again, referring to the Forbes article, they said it's good news and bad news. Good because it creates customer-centric supply chain. Bad because they don't track it and revenue growth. Now, this seems like a contradiction to me to a certain degree, simply because, Rob, you talked about information and data improving the way in which organizations operate. There's the example here of Colgate-Palmolive with a Wi-Fi smart toothbrush. Gathering that information and being able to do it is not the same as being able to utilize it. So where's the breakdown here? Why is it that they can do the front end, but there isn't the focus on being able to then take that information and data and actually make it into something useful?
Well, I think a Wi-Fi connected toothbrush is kind of like a toy, right? I mean, it's there's no risk, that you're getting information on how long people are brushing or how often they're brushing. It's kind of it's almost like a joke, right? I mean, I spend 2 minutes versus you spend 1 minute. But again, when you're talking about sort of payment information, you're talking about financials. You're talking about flows of very secure and confidential information. That's a whole different ballgame. So I think the security issue is certainly a big part of that. And so I think you have to build security into these whole back end applications where you're looking at working with suppliers. I think you have to run pilots. I think this is. I've said it before, you have to run proof of concepts. You have to do this one step at a time. You have to, think through each of the issues and go about it in a structured way. And you really do need to have people that are, the voice of the customer, the voice of the business, someone from finance, someone from procurement, someone from IT, that are all kind of thinking through what the objective is and, where are the high opportunities. Where's the high opportunity, low risk application, the killer app, if you will, that we can start using right away. And I think you also need to look at, the future. Where are we heading in the future? Where do we think customers are going to be at? What are our customers asking for? Where do we think we can drive revenue and offer a service that no one else is currently providing? And what will it take to develop that? So to me, the big opportunity for procurement is connecting suppliers to customers. And if we can improve, the access and the visibility and the sharing of all kinds of information, to me, that's the real value prop here, where I think we can start to make some big inroads.
Okay, now here's the thing, Colin, and just a minute or two on this. Is one of the things Rob said, it's kind of humorous, talk about a Wi-Fi toothbrush. Yeah, is part of that issue with regards to the view of digital transformation, although it is a customer-focused type of initiative they have, but as part of that problem with how people view digital transformation is for the very thing that Rob cited, is from a consumer side of the equation, this may be cool to have running shoes that talk to you and tell you what you're doing and your speed and cadence, and toothbrushes tell you that you're not brushing enough. Is part of the problem with digital transformation at this point for supply chain is that it's not seen beyond the scope of what Rob just talked about a moment ago, that, it's all kind of cool stuff, but really it's not ready for the big leagues?
Well, I think companies will be starting to get ready for the big leagues, but Rob talked about implying what you want to do is avoid risk, which you certainly do. And have pilots, and I think that's probably the way to go about it. You need to test the technology in areas where failure won't matter, or you can very quickly recover the situation. Be aware that there's been failure and recover the situation, and I think that's what businesses will start to do. And I think that's my guess. This really is looking into the future. Is at some stage people will suddenly become, then having piloted things, familiar with using digital technology to manage the supply chain and that's when you'll get the step change. So I think it will build up to a step change, but I think it will gradually, it will take time to do so with pilots all over the place and people just getting more and more familiar. It'll also be impacted by new people joining companies as well, young people who think, just used to using digital stuff anyway. So I think there needs to be a turnover of staff. But again, I'll also link it to objectives. You've got to make sure that the application of digital technology is absolutely linked to objectives of the organization. Otherwise,
all right. So now, okay. So in terms of that, we've got to become more customer focused. But we've got a best way to wrap that up is to say that it has to be tangibly tied to an outcome that is relevant to the organization's objectives overall within a safe environment. In other words, it just can't be sizzled. There has to be some substance behind it. Change. When we talk about change management, that was an area that was touched on in one of the polls. They were talking about it's going slower than expected, adequate skills in the marketplace, and one of the poll results or question was talent shortage, which was kind of interesting, and we'll touch on, and organizational silos in terms of gathering data. I mean, if I look at this, Rob, it comes down to a variety of factors leading to change, but what stands out to me is what you've said consistently. It's the efficient way to gather data and generate algorithms to come to the best conclusions. At the end of the day, does it come down to the fact that you've got to have an output that people can actually use, and at this stage they're not sure they have one?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have. It's really a question of priorities. What is your priority? What are the problems that are the most pressing? If you're working on a problem that nobody cares about, you're not going to get very far. If you're working on something, to give you greater visibility in your supply chain, that can reduce risk, that can allow you to react to issues as they're occurring, that's something that people care about. So in my book, The Living Supply Chain, that I co-published with Tom Linton last year, their digital platform was based on being able to identify disruptions in their supply chain and quickly react to them. It also allows them to identify and increase velocity. I think one of the key issues, the key benefits, is going to be free cash flow. How can we move things through the supply chain more quickly, increase the velocity of decision making and the velocity of material flowing through? And if we can do those things, I mean, that's a real win. That's a real tangible benefit. And to your point here, you need the right people. People need to be part of this equation in addition to technology. And sometimes I think leaders forget that you need the right people on board.
Okay. Now we're moving to the last 10 minutes, so I want to move this along. Colin, building on what Rob had said and going to a talent shortage problem, because he just talked about people, what's interesting in the poll result, people didn't see that talent or finding the right talent was sufficient enough. Yet the industry studies show that there's a continuing and growing gap between what's required and needed in the workforce and what is available. And that gap is getting larger rather than compressing. I mean, so when you look at finding the right talent, when you look at the ability to identify digital supply chain imperatives, and Rob, you touched on that, and the need for more customer knowledge and cleaning and using data, I mean, these are all areas that people have to focus on, and that goes beyond the technology, doesn't it?
Yeah, it goes beyond the technology. I mean, technology is essentially a tool. It'll become, I think, digital an increasingly important tool, and that will change people's roles. I think you've got to be clear as to what talent you need in order to deliver your objectives. And I'm never sure that organizations are very, very good at that. And what talent you had 5 years ago might not actually be suitable nowadays. So how do organizations also transform? You don't want to sack everyone every 5 years. You really need to be able to try and build people's skills for the future. But then you've got to have a pretty clear vision as to what that future might look like. So there's more of a pull, I think, in terms of creating talent. What is the talent that we really need? And I'm not sure organizations are very clear as to what talent they really want. And then they find they haven't got what they want, and then they complain they haven't got it. But what's their strategy for ensuring they've got the right talent? I'm really quite unclear about that. I'm never absolutely sure. I hope there's no HR people here, but maybe there are, that HR organisations have much idea themselves as to what talent they should be searching for or creating.
Well, okay, let's go to this third. I think that leads into the third and final poll, and again, we're going to be wrapping up at around 9:08. We started a little bit later, so we'll get the full hour in for everybody. The next poll is from a digital standpoint, or a digital supply chain standpoint. Am I digitally ready? And again, this is agree, strongly, or somewhat agree, disagree, somewhat or strongly, or not sure. So we'll cue that poll. Rob, in terms of this, and I found this interesting, and alluded to a moment ago, that studies are saying that there is a huge talent gap that is growing in the marketplace overall. And, a variety of studies talk about this in the marketplace. Yet the respondents to the poll indicate that talent shortage or talent isn't one of the key problems there. Is that a disconnect? I mean, how do we view this? Are we digitally ready? Because from what I gather, the technology is exciting, and everything we've talked about in the earlier segments, the algorithms and certainly the advancements are there, but any technological advancement over time has had its upheaval and changes and requirements to acquire new skills. I mean, are we digitally ready? Is there something different about the talent requirement today than, let's say, when other technological innovations were put through?
Well, yeah, I think in a recent study that we did that was with IBM Watson, we found that the number one tool used by organizations today is still Excel. Despite all of these other tools out there, Tableau, Power BI, etc. People are still stuck in Excel. So I think from a digital standpoint, people really aren't ready to move beyond that. I think there's a whole generation of young people that have the ability to work with these new kinds of digital tools and algorithms and so forth. But I was reading Wall Street Journal today, the number of kids that are actually signing up for computer science programs at universities. There's an overflow. Everybody wants to go and work in computer science today, which is exciting. But the problem, of course, is these young people don't have the business acumen and knowledge of what's going on and what's important to the business. So you really need to harness and pair, these young programmers and young people who have these analytical skills with experienced business people so they can solve the problems that matter and work on them together. And I think that's where the real intersection can occur, is when you have experienced business people, and analytic and quant types working together on these kinds of problems.
That's interesting.
Maybe this goes to what Rob was just saying, Colin, is that existing training programs do not identify digital supply chain imperatives and people aren't learning new skills. I mean, it seems to be a common theme throughout this, going back to the very first section we talked about, is that, what are the imperatives? What's the point of digital reinvention in the supply chain? And, based upon getting that first taken care of, then what are the skills to extract that from? I mean, is that very much where we're going here, is that we have to identify what the goals are and what can be accomplished with digital, so it moves or transcends beyond this is cool technology to being here's some bona fide benefits, and then align the skills to extract those benefits? I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is a fair statement, and I think it's not difficult to figure out what some of the key things one would like to achieve through supply chain. Obviously, one wants to reduce supply chain risk, because there can be problems in the supply chain. So how can digital help reduce risk? You want to reduce supply chain costs. Can digitalization help reduce costs? If so, how can it help reduce costs? As part of that, you might also want to reduce supply chain steps. Well, can digitalization help reduce supply chain steps? And can it actually ensure your organization is rather more efficient by taking away some of the basic work that people do and, just taking away some of that and actually starting digitally to manage the supply chain, in which case you're then changing the role of the procurement people almost into systems management rather than doing procurement.
Understood. So at the end of the day, and we've got to wrap this up, good conversation and time flies very quickly, but, we talked about customer facing, but it all seems to come down to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, in these last minute or so, acquiring, cleaning, and using data is the skill that's needed most. We have to actually quantify and justify what going digital means. I mean, is that the safe thing to say?
I think it's the place where organizations need to start is with their data. I think that's the number one thing, and then the other thing is starting to think about how do we do pilots. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Amazon here. I was at a lecture at UNC where they had the head of computer programming for Amazon speaking to a group of students, and he said, "Look, we don't have all the answers with machine-based learning. We do it." And I wrote about this on my blog. Is we do it through trial and error. We make a lot of mistakes along the way, and we've made some really dumb mistakes. And we develop stuff that nobody uses, or it doesn't work properly the way it did in the test. So people have to learn. You have to make mistakes. Amazon believes in and they have no fear of failure, which is why they're successful. So I think you have to have that ability and that willingness to plow forward and make mistakes along the way.
Final, okay, and I'm gonna use this, Colin, and give you the final word here. Rob had originally said and talked about at the top of the hour, you fail quickly and move on, which it sounds like Amazon did. Tying on to what you just talked about, Colin, not that long ago, about Amazon knocking off some well-established long-time grocery chains. I mean, the reality is Amazon is obviously working, and even though they've made the mistakes, even though they've made the error, they're not afraid of failure. They're not risk-averse. And the benefits, based upon what you're saying, Colin, about the grocery chains, seems to merit their move to becoming digital. So at the end of the day, Colin, digital isn't an option, is it?
Well, certainly for the retail industry, it's not. I mean, it wasn't particularly grocery chains. They've gone digital as well. But established chains that really didn't get into digital, into digitization and using the internet, they're the ones that look as if they're failing. There's going to be major changes in UK high streets. Many big shops will disappear. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So it's not just Amazon. There's a whole range of digital suppliers. So it's a very interesting market. I think when you get into other industries, you've got to be a bit more careful. If you're manufacturing vehicles, say cars, then you can absolutely screw up the manufacturing if you start to move too quickly towards digital and make some significant mistakes. You can really make some quite big mistakes there. So I think you've got to do a bit of risk evaluation first. But even in manufacturing, you can identify areas of low risk, pilot those, and then you can build on that knowledge.
Well, you know what? I've got to close by this one thing with risk, and both of you, thank you so much. Time always flies when we have you on here and enjoy the conversation. But with risk, I'll close by the comment of this. I was talking to a general high up in the Canadian defense, and he had said, supply chain for the military is different than everywhere else. Speaking to your point of certain industries have certain risks, he said, if we miss a supply chain, that can cost lives. So realistically speaking, when we look at digital transformation, we have to look at the industry. We have to quantify the risk that's there, and the approach then should be governed by that risk to a certain degree. In other words, it's easier to fail if you're in Amazon to a certain degree than it would be in the situations such as the automobile industry. I mean, is that the best way to say it, is measure a digital transformation? It is coming. It will happen. But depending upon the industry, the progression will be different for each one. I mean, is that a safe way to close this, Colin, and then Rob?
The progression will be different for each one. On the military side, though, there's international competition. So the military have also got to build in digital very much into their plans. Otherwise, the United States are very quickly get left behind. You know, China is developing its digital technology there. So you've also got to keep up with the times or keep ahead of the times somehow. That's risk versus reward, and you need to avoid risk and achieve reward.
All right. Rob, to you.
Yeah, I think it's been a great conversation. I think, we've captured a lot of my key thoughts. It really is about, you have to get started. You start with a vision. You put together the right team of people, and you start with data governance, and you work towards that vision. I like the idea of, an SAP implementation is like building a bridge. You can't cross the bridge until it's completed. Digital transformation is more like a garden. You start enjoying the little pieces of it along the way, and you have a vision for the garden, but you start with the shrubs, you put in some flowers, you put in some stones, and you do it bit by bit.
All right. Well, listen, thank you both, Colin and Rob. And Harsha, I'd like to turn it back over to you. And of course, thank you for attending this webinar. It'll be available on demand. And again, remind you, the tweet chat hashtag is DigitalProc. Anyway, Harsha, back to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, John, Colin, and Rob. I think we can now surely end this webinar. This will be available, like John mentioned, it will be available on the website. We will also be sending you a mail with the recording, so you can look at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.